Hi, everyone. My name is Maddie. I'm in my final semester of my master's degree in music education. And today I'm presenting to you on an article by Robert C. Cook called Nature's Voice in Crumbs, an Idyll for the Misbegotten. So let's just jump right in. So today we're going to start with a little bit of background information about the author, his research and work. We're also going to talk about the author's argument, the thesis, and an outline of his major points. We'll talk about Crumb's Idyll for Misbegotten implications in how we should address the ecological crisis or climate change crisis. And we'll also talk about some discussion questions to help you with your discussion posts. So first, we'll start with a little bit of information about the author, Robert C. Cook. He's a retired associate professor of music theory from the University of Iowa. And he got his degrees at the University of Chicago and Northwestern University. His research interests include chromaticism, contextual music, and languages and practices of music analysis. And in 2015, he received an honorable mention for the Irving Lowndes Memorial Article Award for his work on another Crumb article titled The Vocal Ecology of Crumb's Crickets. And this was published in the Journal of the Society for American Music, Volume 7. This thesis statement is really written in my own words, but I found through this article, through reading it, that through analysis and interpretation of literary and musical elements, Cook reveals how Crumb's An Idyll for the Misbegotten communicates environmental concerns and expresses environmental meaning while simultaneously inviting listeners to give their quiet attention to nature's voice. So we're going to talk about how he does this. So I broke Cook's argument up into four main components. The first being his discussion of nature's voice and what it means for nature to have a voice and how Idyll can be thought to sing in nature's voice. Cook also talks about the story, of Syrinx and the pertinent themes of voice and nature in this story. We also talk about Debussy's Syrinx, which is a piece for solo flute written in 1913, and how the quotation of this piece in Idyll is meaningful. And then also we'll end with a little bit of a reflection on ecological thought and what Idyll tells us to do about climate change and the ecological crisis. So first we'll start with this component of Cook's argument, talking about nature's voice. Cook says that voice gives nature agency, and agency is really the capacity of an individual or of something like nature to have the power and resources to fulfill their potential. So we talk about agency a lot actually in music education with like student agency. But here Cook is talking about the agency of nature and its ability to have a voice, making it efficacious and giving it power to exist and fulfill its potential. Cook also talks about nature's role in society. Crumb, in his program notes, quotes a poem in which nature is referred to in familial terms, such as brother, sister, and mother, like Mother Earth. However, nature and the natural elements are often thought about as resources that need to be managed by humans rather than in these familial terms. Cook also talks about the difference between nature being wild and nature being a part of art. Cook claims that Crumb's piece articulates a gap between nature's wild voice and its role in a mute abstract art, which is kind of an interesting term. But he kind of argues that the wild voice of nature is tamed when it's put into art. And Idyll, Crumb's piece, serves to renew our kinship with nature, renew our sense of thinking of it as family and as a communal element in our lives rather than a resource that we need to manage. It's important to know the story of Syrinx since it's such an important part of the kind of the arc of this piece, the story of this piece, and Cook's argument for what it means for us. So the story of Syrinx appears in a poem by Ovid, who is a Roman poet. And it's kind of in the middle of this other story about Io, which is a different Greek story. But this story says that Pan, the Greek god of wild shepherds and flocks, falls in love with Syrinx, a river nymph known for her chastity. In order to escape Pan, Syrinx asks her fellow river nymphs, to help her, and they transform her into reeds, those plants that you often see along riverbanks. Pan then takes the reeds and cuts them into panpipes, which were known, we know about Pan and his panpipes. There's a picture of him here playing that instrument. This is also an artist's rendering of the story of Syrinx. You can see her running away from Pan. So Cook says here that this story of Syrinx is important because Syrinx sacrifices her body, her corpse, in order for music to be made, in order for art to be made. So really the story is a lament over the price that has to be paid for art, is what Cook says. The Syrinx quote from Debussy in Crumb's piece really serves to dramatize the place of art in response to climate change and this climate crisis. So we're kind of putting art into the argument through this story of Syrinx. The quote from Debussy appears in the B section of Idyll, and that kind of serves to encourage us as listeners to reinterpret the A material when it returns later. So speaking of form, let's talk about that just a little bit. You can see here this table that I took directly from the article. And we can see a little bit of the arch form that we know Crumb really likes to use. So we have our A section with A 1, 2, 3, and then when A prime happens, when the A material returns, it appears in reverse order. So it kind of has that same arch form that we're used to. So let's talk about each section individually. The A section is motivically abundant. There's lots of motives. They're developed kind of wildly, as Cook puts it. So he characterizes this first section as a wild voice and as the voice of nature. This is also where the trichord wide 0, 1, 2 is introduced, which is important to the work, and also where the octatonic CD collection, that sounds like a collection of music CDs, but octatonic scale with the notes C and D in it appears in the piece. The B section is really different, and it's characterized by that Debussy Syrinx quotation and a regular pulse, which we hadn't really heard yet in this piece. It also combines that wide 0, 1, 2 trichord and the Syrinx quote to form what Cook calls the pan pentachord. And you can see the pitch class right there. This section is characterized by discipline, control, and ultimately closure. So it's really a lot different from nature's wild voice in the A section. The A prime section, as I noted, is reversed from the A section, and it's also abbreviated and compressed version of the material we already heard. The voice of the A section, Cook says, has been managed and domesticated, and it's more like the nature that we industrial aged humans are accustomed to seeing. It's controlled, it's part of, I guess what I'll say is it's, like he said, managed, domesticated, controlled, and not freely and wildly developed, as Cook talks about for the A section. So really what this tells us, and what ultimately Cook is arguing, that Idyll allows us to have a space in which we contemplate art in the role of nature and this kind of dilemma of consumption. So I'll read this quote here on the screen. It says, "We can seek to capture the beauty in nature, but to do so, even with the intention of celebrating it, is to consume it." So Cook is pointing out here that we really face a dilemma as artists and as musicians, that we need the resources of nature in order to make our art. And at the same time, art is one of the best ways for us as humans to understand nature and express our understanding of nature and have a sense of reverence for nature. So really we have a dilemma here of both needing to consume nature, but not wanting to fully consume it so that it doesn't exist anymore. Crumb also, Cook argues, forces us into kind of a sense of nostalgia for a time no living human or recorded culture can claim to recall. So in order to understand the full weight of the climate crisis and climate change, we have to think back to a time when humans didn't exist in the history of the Earth in order to really fully understand the impact that climate change is having on our way of living and on the Earth as a whole. Ultimately, Cook is arguing that Crumb is telling us that we need to be quiet and humble in nature in order to fully appreciate it and maybe begin this journey of understanding the ecological crisis. There's a great quote in there from Leopold that I encourage you to read, in which this quote kind of comes from, but Cook tells us that if we are quiet and humble, we may witness the non-human as agent in its delight, not ours, or not just ours. That leads me to my discussion questions for you all. The first being related to that quote that I just referenced. The first question is, have you ever experienced the feeling of being quiet and humble in nature that Cook and Leopold describe? Is there music that recalls this feeling for you, or is there music that expresses a different feeling related to nature for you? When I think of this, I think of being alone in nature and kind of being overwhelmed by the grandeur of nature. I'm not sure I have music in mind that evokes that feeling for me, but definitely I've had that feeling before. My second question is, Cook quotes a question posed by ecomusicologist Aaron Allen in relation to music's role in the ecological crisis. And he poses this question kind of as a rhetorical question, but I want you to see if you can answer it. The question is musicology part of the problem or part of the solution? Again, in reference to the ecological crisis. So I'm curious what your answer to this question is. Third, throughout the article, Cook characterizes art as controlled, aesthetic, abstract, and mute, namely to distinguish it from the natural and wild character of nature. Do you agree with these descriptions of art? I thought they were kind of striking, so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about that. And then finally, what do you think about the dilemma between art's role in inspiring a reverence for nature and its role in nature's destruction? And if you need some help thinking through that, there's a quote from the author Bates in paragraph 46. The end of that quote is, "You create culture by enslaving nature," which again is really interesting and I think a relevant dilemma for us to think about as musicians. That concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. If you have any additional questions, you can feel free to email me, but I look forward to seeing your discussion posts. Thanks, everyone.